been set up so I can sit on the...
Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
I'll just say a prayer as we in our theology group always begin with a prayer, so we're going to say that. Okay? Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death on the nose and the tombs, bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death on the nose and the tombs, bestowing life. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death on the nose and the tombs, bestowing life. I hand over now to our anchor man, Andre Davidov.
All right, welcome everybody to another Sunday evening talk. So we've had 3 talks so far. Tonight is the beginning of a new series of talks that will be led by Father Nicholas Karapov. The overarching theme is Introduction to Orthodox Christianity. So at each talk, Father Nicholas will be leading a talk, and then there'll be a guest speaker. There'll be a question and answer after each talk. So if you want to send through any questions pertaining specifically to the topics that are covered during the talks, please do so in the YouTube comment section, and I'll be monitoring that and writing it down, and then we'll be giving those questions to Father Nick Karapov and then Father Nicholas Delinkevich, respectively, after the conclusion of their talks. Basically, the topics that are going to be covered and touched upon will be structured around the dynamics of who am I, the questions of who am I, who is Christ, and what is the church. So to understand these, we need to look at the Bible and the answers that the Bible provides us in relation to this. And also, as well as an analysis of the creed, the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. Yes, I got it right. Okay, so tonight's Father Nicholas Karapov's topic tonight is titled "The Meeting, the personal dimension of God and human beings, our relationship with Him and with each other." And Father Nicholas Delinkevich's talk is titled "Science, Its Limits and Its Potential to Complement Religious Knowledge." So once again, please add any questions in the comment section of the YouTube, and we'll be passing those on to each priest. Yep.
Maybe after my talk and the questions, you can introduce Father Nicholas's topic again.
Yes.
Just to remind people what he's going to be talking about.
Remind me also. Remind me also.
And remind you too. All right. Okay. I'm just wondering if that mic is not too far away from me. No, this is coming across well. Yeah, maybe just bring it over a bit closer. All right. My talk tonight is the meeting, the personal dimension of God and us human beings, and our relationship with Him and with each other. And now I thought that the best way to begin would be to mention about this morning's Gospel reading, Sunday reading. It's the 4th Sunday after Easter. That includes the great day of Easter itself. That's how these weeks or Sundays are numbered. This Sunday, the reading was about actually a meeting. And the meeting was Christ meeting a man who lay beside the sheep pool at Bethesda, and for 38 years he was waiting for his opportunity to get healing. And when the Lord asked him, do you want to be well? Do you want to be healed? He says, I do not have a man who can carry me when the waters are troubled by the angel, because only the first person who goes in the water is healed. Now, this whole story, of course, is intimately connected with what is called the economy of our salvation. That's what the Bible is about, the economy of our salvation, God's plan. Because the sheep pool is a symbol of baptism. Baptism that opens the door into this new life. Now, Christ is the man. The poor man who was paralyzed did not have anyone who could help him for 38 years. Now, that's a real commentary on the human race. So, to say, I don't have a man, would have been similar to saying, pardon the expression, I don't have anyone who gives a damn about me. So the Saviour comes and introduces everything, introduces a new life, the life that begins in baptism, a life of healing. Now, the other way that this is connected with baptism is that during baptism we hear reading from Romans, St. Paul's letter to the Romans, where he writes that baptism is a participation in Christ's death and resurrection. Now, the sheep pool was used to also wash sacrificial animals before they were sacrificed. Christ is the Lamb of God. So you see the connection. Okay. And the important message of that story is that the coming of Christ and the new life that he brings is all about changing the way that human beings operate. And in a world where there is so little love, so little care for other people's pain, he introduces a new humanity, which is the church that lives according to his commandment of love. And he is the one who gives an example, a living example, and not only a living example, but that's something that we're going to have to talk about much more in the future. But for our purposes today, this is the thing about the meeting with the Lord. All right, so it establishes a point of contact for us, a relationship. Now, when I was thinking about the topic for tonight's talk, I remembered about the story of Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, who was a person who died in the 1990s, and he did a great deal for the English-speaking Orthodox Christianity, because he lived in London, all right? And he tells us of his story, how he, as a 14-year-old boy, had a very powerful conversion experience, which, he talks about as the meeting, his meeting. And it went like that, like this. He was 14. He belonged to a generation of youth, very young people who were sons and daughters of a defeated generation, defeated in the Russian Civil War. And they came to, they left Russia and they went to many different countries, including France, where his family was. And so this young generation was brought up on these emotions and feelings that, they have to fight back for their country, to get rid of communism, so on and so forth. So it was all about power and fighting and so on. And it just so happened that the youth leader of their youth club asked a member of their group to attend a talk that was given by a prominent priest from Paris. Now, he was living in provincial France, his family was. And so he went along to that meeting because he had great respect for his youth leader. And so I think they played some sort of sport like basketball or something. I don't remember exactly what it was. So he went along and he said that he decided to himself that he would just do it for the sake of their club. All right, but he thought, I'd just get into that hall, into that room, find the furthest possible corner from that priest, and just sit there and think my own thoughts. But he says, unfortunately, that priest had a really piercing voice. It was so annoying that he couldn't focus on his own thoughts, and willy-nilly had to listen to what the priest was saying. And the more he said I was listening to what he was saying, the more agitated and angry I became, he said. And because the priest was talking about things like forgiveness, humility, love, and all of the things that these young people thought were showing weakness, because they weren't particularly religious. They were nominal Orthodox Christians. All right. So he rushed home and he thought, I'm going to finish with this Christ once and for all. So he asked his mother if they had a gospel. She says, yes. On the shelf there was gathering dust. So he took the gospel, found the shortest, the Gospel of Mark, and he started reading it. And he said, I read one chapter, and then between the second and third chapter, he appeared. He says, I couldn't see him, but he was standing on the other side of the table. And he meant Christ. And he said, he would not go away until I finished the whole, reading the whole gospel. And that reading totally converted this young 14-year-old. He became such a fervent, zealous, as a young man, he became a bit of a Bible basher. And he would annoy everyone. Have you read the Bible? Have you read the gospel? Okay, but it was the beginning. It was a meeting. It was a conversion. It was a personal meeting with Christ. And when I first came across that story decades ago, I thought, wow, that's a very powerful experience. Now, I'd like to share another experience, a personal experience. Now, this is you can read about this particular experience in a book by a priest in America who belongs to the Antiochian diocese there, and his name is Father James Bernstein. Now, obviously, he comes from a Jewish family. As a matter of fact, before the Second World War, his father was actually a rabbi in Germany, but they fled. They went to America, so on and so forth. But he said, I had never heard anything good about Christ, Yeshua. Okay? And when I was 15, at high school, a classmate of mine who was a Jehovah's Witness, gave me their version of the gospel. The Jehovah's Witness, rather sanitized version, because Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe that Christ is God, Son of God, the way that traditional Christianity believed from the beginning, the church believed. So anyway, he said, when I read the gospel, that gospel, it had such a powerful effect on me that I couldn't find peace. And he said, I started praying, and I asked God, look, God, you've got to tell me if this Yeshua, Jesus, is he the Messiah? Is he really the Christ? And he said, not long after I started praying like this, I had an experience. He said, I can't describe exactly what happened, but I was given such knowledge that was beyond any doubt. It was a total knowledge that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Christ. And he said, I believed from that day on. And his long story begins. It's an interesting book. It's called Surprised by Christ. It's really worth reading, because it's not only a personal testimony of his journey. He went through Jews for Jesus in the 70s, and then after a journey through Protestant Christianity, he went on to Roman Catholicism, and eventually came to Orthodoxy and became a priest. He was ordained a priest. All right. Yeah. So that's a wonderful book and a wonderful testimony. Now, I thought I would share something with you too, something personal, because I don't want these talks to be just talks about God. Of course, of necessity, they have to be like that. But this is why I thought I'd start from these testimonies, and I call this the meeting, because it's important to give a very personal touch to all of this, because, as a priest, I'm not in this for some objective or theoretical reason, but it has to do with life itself. And for me, there was a meeting like that too. Now, I didn't have the same sort of experience that Metropolitan Anthony had, and not even the same sort of knowledge that Father James had, but I had a conversation with my spiritual father on the 7th of December 1975, and it just happened to be the day before his heart surgery. His name was a very respected priest in Sydney, Archpriest Rostislav Gunn, and he died the next day. Now, of course, I didn't know what would be happening, and for some reason I decided to visit him in hospital just the day before the operation. And the conversation that he had with me, in retrospect, I understood that it wasn't just him talking to me, but it's something like, we say in the Creed, and we're going to be hopefully talking about aspects of the Creed. In the Creed, in the article about the Holy Spirit, we say that he spoke by the prophets or through the prophets. And sometimes, the prophets were not necessarily people that we recognize as, authors of certain books in the Old Testament or whatever, but we know of many New Testament prophets, and they're called spiritual elders. And maybe sometimes God just gives some word of His to a person, especially a person who realized, I think he felt, because I had never seen him the way that I saw him that day, because I felt that he belonged somewhere else, that he wasn't really, he was only partially on earth, as it were, his spirit was elsewhere. And he said certain things to me which changed my life, because I had never thought about the priesthood seriously at all, or not at all, until that day, the 7th of December 1975. So I think that this is how events like that can change our life, and everyone needs to have this touch and to understand that what comes from God is a very personal touch. It's not just something abstract, objective. This is why people who want to objectify God, and later on, in our second talk, Father Nicholas Delinkovich might be bringing up things about, objectivity in science and so on and so forth. Well, in religion, in our faith, it is a very subjective and personal experience. It's a relationship. It's a way that we can know another person, another human being. In the same way, we can get to know God. An early Christian writer in the 5th century, Evagrius of Pontus, he says, if you pray, you will be a theologian. And if you're a theologian, you will pray. Because a theologian is a person who gets to know God personally. It's not a theologian is not a professor who collects objective data about God, but he has a relationship. He knows about God personally. Okay, and that's much more important. This is what I wanted to accent to you today. Now, there is one of the great feasts of the church is called the Meeting of the Lord, and the story of that particular feast is that on the 40th day after the birth of Jesus, his mother and Joseph bring him to the temple in order to receive the blessings and make these sacrifices that were appropriate. And they are met by a couple of people, and one of these people is the elderly man by the name of Simeon, who takes little 40-day-old baby Jesus, into his arms, and he says a wonderful speech which has been used as a hymn in the church since the apostolic times. In Latin, that hymn is called Nunc Dimittis. That's, now you let your servant depart, for my eyes have seen the salvation which you have prepared for your people. A wonderful prayer, and this reflects that sense of relief that a soul feels when it discovers the Lord God in a personal encounter. There's a sense of relief and satisfaction and peace, and now I don't have to worry about things because my life is mapped out, or my death in the case of this elderly man. It was promised to him that he would not die until he saw the Lord's Christ. Now, also this gospel story in the 2nd chapter of Luke's gospel talks to us about Christ's vulnerability. Okay? And this is something that Metropolitan Anthony understood even as a teenager, because he and his generation of young people were striving towards power, force, to get rid of those nasties, right? And he suddenly understood that Christ works in a different way. He works through humility, meekness, non-aggression. That's what meekness means. And that became one of the most powerful themes in Metropolitan Anthony's life. Now, I'd like to suggest to you that when we read the Old Testament, the Orthodox have absolutely no doubt that the person who speaks to Adam, Noah, Abraham, all the prophets, is actually the Son of God. Okay? Who comes and is born later and is presented to this elderly man, Simeon, as a baby. This same person, because when he's born, his personhood is divine and human. How do we know about it? Well, I'll tell you this. Orthodox iconography is full of it. I'll just show you a fresco up on our southern wall that shows Christ talking on Mount Tabor, on the mountain of Transfiguration, with two Old Testament prophets, Moses and Elijah. There they are. And so it's clear that he speaks to them, and you can read in all of the four accounts of the Holy Transfiguration that Moses and Elijah spoke to him, and he speaks to them about his passion, death, and resurrection. All right, and he speaks to them as their master, clearly. Okay, that's one biblical and iconographic image. Now, if you go to some churches and some places, one place I can think of is the church of the Holy Transfiguration Monastery in Bambala, where it shows the Son of God in the same iconographic style as the incarnate Jesus in the scene of the creation of Adam and Eve. So, now why does the Orthodox Church think that it is actually the Son of God who speaks to the Old Testament prophets? Well, you may have heard or read that Jesus Christ most frequently referred to himself as the Son of Man. That was his most frequent reference to himself, the Son of Man. Now, if you check chapter 7 in the book of Prophet Daniel, you'll see a description of someone like the Son of Man walking on clouds towards the Ancient of Days. And when you see the description of the Ancient of Days and compare it to the description of someone who appears and calls himself Alpha and Omega in the book of Revelation, first chapter, it's exactly the same description. So it's clear that the Ancient of Days and Alpha and Omega, the Son of God, the Lamb of God of the book of Revelation, is that same person. Right? So that's very important for us, because the Son of God is the one who looks after what theologians call the economy or the housekeeping of God's plan of our salvation. Yes. I'd like to finish in about 5 minutes because I gave myself 30 minutes and I'm just watching and I've been talking for 25 minutes. I'd like to just wrap things up for tonight and say that, look, personhood, that's something that we're going to be talking about in greater detail later on. And personhood is something that clearly comes out of the Bible. It begins building up in the Old Testament with the description of the God of Israel, the God of the Bible. And this concept of personhood is really built up in the New Testament through the revelation of our Lord Jesus Christ about the inner life of God, about God as a unity in Trinity and Trinity in unity, and what this means, and that our personhood and our ability to be absolutely unique, and Christ makes it quite plain when he says that what does it profit a man if he should gain the whole world and lose his soul? It means that Christ puts the value of one soul, one life, one human being above all of the things of the world. And it means that each one of us has the capacity to become unique, but that capacity is only given, again, in a relationship with God. It is fed. We are fed in our growth, the flowering of our personhood through our relationship with God and our relationship with other human beings. Now, when Andre was introducing the sort of talks that we'll be doing, he said that, I'll be talking about who am I, an understanding of anthropology, Christian anthropology. Who are we human beings? And specifically, we need to know, who am I personally? What are my problems? What are the problems of humanity generally, or rather the problem? We'll talk about that on another occasion. But what are my specific problems? Okay? And only then I can understand what my relationship with Jesus Christ is about, because he's called my Savior. So I need to understand what I need to be saved from. Okay? And the third thing is that Christ speaks of salvation in the context of his church. The church is his new Israel of all nations, right? And St. Paul in Galatians writes beautifully, bear each other's burdens, and this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. The law of Christ is about love, is about caring about the other person, not seeing someone for 38 years, as we heard at the beginning in today's gospel story, and saying, oh, what the heck, I don't care. All right? So a change in us so that we have the patience and the love, and we begin to understand about our connectedness, personal connectedness with each other, that this is what God intended human beings to be like, to live in harmony, to live in the spirit of meekness, spirit of humility with each other, spirit of forgiveness, but not spirit of pride and, I'm always right and whatever I say, is the law. It's either my way or the highway. Well, that can never lead to any kind of harmony or peace, but can only lead to pain through coercion, enmity. One of the early Holy Fathers, Dorotheus of Gaza, he gives a model. He says, this is the way that we can understand the relationship between us as human beings and between us and God. He says, think of a circle with the center being God, right? If we move closer to each other and we shorten the distance of the circumference between the points on the circumference, between us, then we're going to move up closer to towards the center, because the circumference becomes smaller. If we move along the radii towards the center, we're going to get closer to each other. So there's a dynamic of a relationship between our attitude and relationship with God and our relationship with human beings. Okay? That's how it works. And for that reason, Christ gave 2 commandments. And when he was being asked by the Pharisees, by the lawyers, the specialists in the law of Moses, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Because they genuinely did not know. There's not 10 commandments, did you know? No. There's actually 613 commandments in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, 613 commandments. All right, so obviously they were a little bit confused about that. So he pointed out that the 2 commandments, which are really like one, are the commandments to love God and with all your being, all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, which means if your neighbor hurts, you hurt. If someone's lying by the sheep pool, you see and you try to help him. If a person can be helped, he should be helped. We should not have this attitude, it's not my problem. I think that might be enough. I've gone over my time. All right. Okay.
Thank you, Father Nicholas. We have stunned silence.
Stunned silence.
Yes. But I do have one question, and well, actually, there's 2, but they might be whole new topics that you'll speak on later.
Well, okay.
Do you want to hold off?
Tell me what the questions are, and
Yep.
I'll see if they can be.
Okay, so the first question that came through was, how do the challenges differ in maintaining a relationship with Christ between cradle Orthodox and converts?
So what the difference between the relationship with Christ between...
Yeah, maintaining a relationship. How do the challenges differ for converts and cradle Orthodox in maintaining their relationship with Christ?
All right. Well, look, I think that really there should not be all that much difference. Mm-hmm. You know why? Because every Christian, if they come to Christianity as a child, as a baby, like I was. Nobody asked me my permission to baptize me as a baby, but I'm eternally grateful for that. Okay, but it means that when we reach adulthood, each one of us has to reconfirm that commitment that was made on our behalf by somebody else, our parents, our godparents or sponsors, as we say, yeah? In that sense, I wouldn't sort of differentiate it too much. Sometimes I'm envious of people who come as adults to the church because they have a freshness of perception that cradle Christians may not have, because we've always heard these things. Oh yeah. But for a person who comes as an adult, everything is so fresh and new, and I can imagine how people reacted to the preaching of the apostles when they first heard about these things. And we have a really jaded view of the New Testament, of the gospel story. Look at, you can't see it beyond that column, so I won't try to get the camera to look at that. But we have a composition there on the wall, a lower section of the wall in our murals, in our frescoes, of Christ talking to the Samaritan woman at the well. Now that's just happens to be next Sunday's topic, next Sunday's theme, okay, a gospel story. It was revolutionary in the times. What Christ did, he sat down and spoke to a woman, first of all, who was not Jewish. She was a Samaritan, and Jews and Samaritans just didn't talk to each other. Okay. Secondly, you didn't talk to another, woman unless, there were all sorts of rules and social mores. And a woman in the ancient world was like personal property of the husband. And Christ treats women as human beings, no different to men. And look how important women become in the church from the beginning. That we just recently had the memory of the myrrh bearers, people like Mary Magdalene and the others and so on. And there were so many women preachers, and whole nations have been converted by women. So like Saint Nina of Georgia, equal to the apostles. Nina of Georgia, she was a cousin of St. George, by the way. Or Mary Magdalene, who spoke in Rome, holding an egg as a symbol of life in the tomb. So that's just one example, and that freshness, I think it's valuable. It's valuable when a person comes fresh to Christianity, to Orthodoxy. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that we cradle Orthodox and cradle Christians sometimes miss out on these things, and I sometimes, very often, I'm really encouraged and enthused and inspired by some of the things I hear from people who are just learning about Christianity as adults. Mm-hmm. So what was the other question?
Okay, so the other one was whether there's a difference, or whether it's two sides of the same coin, or facets of, in terms of relationship between your personal relationship with Christ or with God, and then the kind of the communal relationship, as in when you're in a church. So when you're by yourself, and then when you're in church, and how those two relate. But are they separate to a certain extent? Do they feed each other?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's actually a very good question. Look, there is a difference in emphasis, in nuance, but not in essence. Because even when we pray as Christians, we pray personally, individually. We are taught never to divorce ourselves from the rest. And this is why when the apostles asked Christ, teach us to pray, he gave them the prayer, our Father. Not my Father, our Father. So if I'm saying our Father privately, I'm reminded that I'm not alone. It's not just me and him. Okay? And we have countless witnesses to this in the lives of the ascetic fathers and mothers, the strugglers of the desert, who prayed for the whole world. They connected, they felt this connection. And in a small way, we can understand that too. Look, we've had live streaming of services, but I can tell from people's reactions that they have felt connected to the church through this. And I have certainly felt a connectedness to them during these services, all right? It's not just something that happened, we haven't turned the church into a studio. No, it's the real thing, okay? So this connection remains, whether we're together or we're praying privately, but of course communal prayer has much greater strength. It was demonstrated to me on one occasion when I was a young seminarian, and one of the priest monks there, a very respected man by the name of Father Vladimir, who ran the monastery office, and he was like a real PR man for the monastery. There was always a radiant smile on his face, beautiful man. And he once asked me, he says, look, I've been asked to say some prayers at our monastery cemetery. Can you come and help me sing? So I went along, and it was, this is New York State, and Jordanville is up on the plateau. Down below is Mohawk Valley. And the plateau is much colder than the valley. Spring typically would begin, and the blooming would begin 2 weeks before in the valley. Okay, it's much colder. So a pretty breezy spring day, and we went to the cemetery, which was up on the hill, pretty exposed. And this family came from New York, and they wanted to say panihida, some prayers for their departed person. Might have been like an anniversary or something. And so they had a bunch of candles, and they gave them out, and they tried to light the candles, but because of the breeze, the spring breeze, the candles kept going out. So Father Vladimir turned to me and he said, I'll show you something. And he collected all the candles, bunched them together, and put them together on the grave, and he lit them. And we started singing the service, and the wind began to blow. It was blowing from one side and then from almost the opposite side. It was really weird, and strong enough so there was smoke, and you couldn't see any sort of flame. Yeah, I thought, it's going to go out, but it didn't go out. And I thought to myself, wow, what an image of the church, the prayers, communal prayers, people praying together. Mm-hmm. So, we help each other and we support each other. That's about the church. Okay?
I've got one more.
Yes.
That's the question. That's
the question.
I'll read this out to you.
Yes.
Often when we say that Christ came to save us from death, Many of us wonder how that is true, since after Christ, humanity continues to die.
Yes, well, I'll let St. John Chrysostom answer that question. And he answers it this way. He says, people say this, well, what's the difference? I mean, people still die. He says, but the difference is that when a Christian dies, he dies. His death is like a falling asleep. It's no different to going to bed at night, because there is no fear of disappearance. That, of course, other cultures have beliefs in the afterlife, and even like the Egyptians and various even like animistic tribes have had these ideas about the afterlife. Okay, but the idea of Christ's resurrection is such a powerful one. You see, St. Paul writes that if Christ didn't rise from the dead, well, we're the saddest of all people. But think of it this way, and I mentioned, I think in my last talk on live stream, that Christ's resurrection is one of the best established facts of history, if not the best established fact, all right? Because there have been so many witnesses to, St. Paul mentions 500 people gathered together in Galilee who knew him before his death and saw him resurrected. And think about this. All of the efforts that were put into the stopping this, rumor or sort of falsehood. What was done with the tomb, and the sealing of the tomb, the soldiers guarding the tomb, and everything, only served to confirm the veracity, the truth of Christ's resurrection. And then, look, think of it psychologically. Could these people, the apostles, who was simple people, and that they were not some sort of new agey, intellectuals. They were simple fishermen and so on. They went out. Look at the way they write the Gospels. The Gospel accounts are very, very literal witness statements. That's what they are. They're witness statements. They're not. Compare that to anything in the religious literature of the other cultures. You'll see that it's vastly different. The Bible and the New Testament, the Gospel, is vastly different to all that. It is stuff written by actual witnesses, and these witnesses went, and they were ready to die, and most of them did die. They sealed their word with their own blood. The apostles and so on. Not many of them survived. Long term, and did not spill their blood. And the central aspect of the good news was the resurrection. They spoke with such conviction, such power. God gave them the word to speak, and their words often were accompanied with all sorts of signs and healings and so on. In the same way that Christ, when he spoke, after he spoke, he would perform healings and miracles, like the story of the paralyzed man by the sheep pool and so on. They did that, and the faith in the resurrection is something so deep in especially Orthodox Christianity that glory be to God that we haven't lost the focus. And the focus, as if you come into this church, you'll see that the central icon, operator, can we maybe have a look at the chandelier will get in the way. Chris, can you lift the camera so that maybe you can see that? Above, higher. Now I think there you go. Oh, okay, good. You see Christ right in the middle of the chandelier there. Well, that's the central composition of the whole church and of our faith, because that is the composition painted and used during Easter as the icon of for the resurrection. But it actually depicts what is called the harrowing of hell, or Christ's descent into Hades. It shows the moment when Christ dies on the cross and his soul goes into Hades, and he takes Adam and Eve by the hand, and all of the righteous people, or all the people who repented, all the people who recognized him, and that keeps happening because he's still there. I mean, there's no time there, so he meets. We can meet him there too. If we. That is painted in an illustration of the troparion, or the main hymn of Easter. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and on those in the tombs bestowing life. In the tombs means the life of humanity without God, without hope. There you have it. I mean, the resurrection, and Christ is just the firstborn. He's the first of those risen from the dead. Okay, now we believe in the continuation of our consciousness after our death, and we have so many stories, and I'm going to get Father Nicholas to publish a story that is very powerful about a certain monastic in the Holy Land, Father Mifodi, who had a clinical death experience, and that particular story is just really fascinating, because of certain aspects of it. It just could not have been any kind of brain happening. It was an existential fact of the soul leaving the body and seeing things that were confirmed by other people. All right? So, look, it is a big question, and I hope that we can gain a sense of that centrality of the resurrection. This is why the feast of the resurrection, the feast of Pascha, is so central in Orthodox Christianity. We haven't shifted to a sense where we see, Christmas is more important because it's like birthday of Jesus. No, it's the resurrection. That's what Christ is here for. He saves us from death, and death has many meanings. First of all, it has a spiritual meaning, because he said to Adam, and you read it in Genesis, the day that you stretch your hand to that forbidden fruit, you're going to die. What he meant was, you're going to die spiritually first, and then you'll die physically. Okay? But Christ, the resurrection begins with our spiritual rebirth. We're no longer zombies when we find Christ and we live the life of Christ. Okay? We live because at the burning bush, God said to Moses, I am being, I am he, I am that I am. I am he that is, he that exists. God gives being to everything and every one of us. We do not have autonomous being. Our being comes from God. If God wanted to, he could pull the plug on any of us and we would cease to exist. He doesn't do it because he loves us. Even Satan, even the fallen angels, he loves them. I've said this before. But as our life, our spirit, our soul, and our body are filled with the energies of God, the energies of the resurrection, we begin to function in a different way. And you have to read the lives of the saints to get a kind of an existential feel for all that. Okay, look, I think that we should
Move on.
Move on
Okay.
to because otherwise, it's 8 o'clock.
Okay, before I go on, before I introduce Father Nicholas Delinkevich, D as we call him, I just want to remind you, you can comment in the YouTube chat. If you want to send in a question anonymously, my phone number is in the chat, right? So we're not ignoring you. We've written several times what the phone number is. Look in the chat, the phone number's there. Send me a text. I'll read it to the fathers, okay? So now we move on to Father Nicholas Delinkevich, who I will remind you will be speaking of science, its limits, and its potential to complement religious knowledge.
Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.
When Father Nick answered the third question, the first part of his answer was almost a chunk out of my talk. It was a direct link. I was just thinking here, well, I can already say half of my stuff now. My talk, I want that to be understood by people who have not got a strong scientific background. And so, for that reason, I will have to speak much more slowly than the way Father Nick spoke. Otherwise, stuff will go over their heads. The other thing is that the topic that I'm covering has got a large number of parts, like a jigsaw puzzle, and those parts are linked logically to one another to get the bigger picture. It's like getting a picture of a ladder with rungs, and each of those parts of the puzzle are the rungs in a ladder. The talk has 4 fundamental components. The first bit is proof of God's existence in a scientific sense as distinct from a philosophical sense. The next bit is, I'll argue, that Jesus used science to prove his divinity. I'm not sure now how to ask or say the next statement, because Father Nick described a theologian as somebody who prays deeply to God. I have a different definition. This is this, that some of the best theologians in the 21st century are atheists. I think Father Nick's heart's just stopped a beat. Do you understand? All right. And then the fourth bit is the limits of science. If we were to do a survey, whether it's amongst the general public or amongst theologians or academics or anybody for that matter, and you asked in that survey what their views are on religion and science, almost without doubt, virtually everybody would say that science deals with fact and that religion deals with faith, full stop. The second part of the survey, I think, would reveal that there is no proof that God exists, not in a scientific sense again. So yesterday I had a quick look at the Stanford University Encyclopedia of Faith, on faith, and specifically this was targeting looking at religion, faith, as in terms of religion, and I'm only guessing here, I didn't go through the whole thing, but there would have been about 50 pages on this topic, religion, faith and religion. And there were about 12, thereabouts, different definitions of faith. Yet, if we were to go back to this survey that I'm referring to, I think you would find that there's essentially one definition that people in general believe to be true. I will quote two definitions, essentially the same, from a science forum, Quora, that I looked up yesterday. And the first guy said this: most basic definition of faith is the acceptance of and belief in something for which there is no objective evidence. The second guy said something similar. Faith is belief without evidence. The reason faith is often linked to religion is due to the lack of available evidence, leaving them only with faith to fuel their belief. And I think most people would understand that's what faith is, a belief without evidence. To a large extent, this is true. The problem is that youth, Christian youth, Orthodox youth, who now go to university and study a big, wide realm of disciplines, topics, and from the intellectual perspective, they find that definition to be an obstacle to their belief. That once something deviates from fact, then that becomes problematic, belief-wise. I will argue that science is practical theology. It's not a case of science and theology. Science is theology. That's one bit. The other bit that I will argue is that there is proof that God exists using scientific criteria. To do that, we need to have a look at how science works. The theories that are used in science have effectively got three levels. At the most basic level, it's conjecture, and that is basically personal opinion, no more than that. Then you have hypothesis. The hypothesis is a serious understanding. It's based largely on observation, but that's where it stops. Then we go to theory, and theory is linked to fact in science. So a theory, a scientific theory, would contain mathematics, it would contain formulae, it would be, if it's an experiment we're looking at, it'll be repeatable, it will give the same results, and it can predict things. So theory in a scientific sense differs from theory that people use generally. So when somebody says, oh, this is just theory, they're really referring to a hypothesis or maybe even conjecture. But scientific theory is not what is normally understood by the word theory. Now, there's also a common belief that science proves how nature works. In fact, science does not prove anything. And in that context, I will quote from Stephen Hawking. Probably most of you would have heard of him. He died recently. He's a very, very famous scientist, a physicist, cosmologist. The quote, it's only one paragraph. The first part of that is easy to understand. The second bit can be a bit confusing. So I'll read that paragraph first, and then I'll explain. But it's important in the context of proof. So Stephen Hawking says, any physical theory is always provisional in the sense that it is only a hypothesis. You can never prove it. Important bit. No matter how many times the results of experiments agree with some theory, you can never be sure that the next time the result will not contradict the theory. On the other hand, you can disprove a theory by finding even a single observation that disagrees with the prediction of the theory. Okay, the last bit's sort of a few words that might be hard to remember. I'll use an example that's commonly used in popular science. It goes like this. A guy is doing research on swans, birds. And he goes from place to place, country to country, and this study goes for, say, 3 years. And he comes back home, he goes to university, and he starts writing his PhD thesis. And in that thesis he writes that he studied some 500, maybe 1,000 birds, and they were all black. So the theory is all swans are black. Why is this scientific? It's scientific because it only takes one white swan to appear on the scene and his theory crashes. So that means that for a theory to be scientific, it must be potentially falsifiable. To the extent that it's not been shown to be false, it keeps being valid. It's a valid theory. Same thing as Einstein's theories, exactly the same thing. They must in principle be falsifiable. If they're not, then they are no different to opinion or hypotheses. So I hope that's clear. And so if any kind of comment about a theory is not in principle falsifiable, it is not scientific. That's what it boils down to. So now we go to the next part of proof about God's existence. And we now need to know how proof works. In nature, for the purposes of our discussion, there are 3 parts. Nature has physical matter and energy. The next bit is there are laws of nature. Newton's law of gravity, Einstein's law of general relativity. These are laws of nature. Then there are constants of nature, things like the speed of light, which is 300,000 kilometres per second. Or another constant, a main one, is the ratio between the mass of a proton and an electron is always 1,836.15. Whether you're looking at that ratio here on Earth, Andromeda Galaxy, anywhere else in the whole universe, that ratio must be the same. If it's not the same, then chemistry collapses. So these are the 3 bits that I want to use in our discussion. Now, the last 2 bits, laws of nature and constants of nature, they determine how nature works. And so that relates to earlier back where we talked about Stephen Hawking's comment that the how bit is not always factually known by scientists. However, proof in science does exist. Where? When the existence of things or events that occur in nature, they can be proved by observation. So, if I see the moon, that is proof that the moon exists. It doesn't have to be a scientific observation, it's just an observation. The moon exists because I can see it, you can see it, we can see it. So what we see, that constitutes proof. How that thing that we're looking at behaves in relation to other bodies, like how the moon orbits the Earth, and how the Earth orbits the Sun, and so on, and the Sun, our solar system goes around the Milky Way galaxy. How that happens, that is not proof. That is the theory that we referred to before. But the existence of something is proved by observation. That's the important bit. Seeing can be, that's a generic term that I was using, it could be clearly hearing, touching, sight, well, the normal human senses. They can confirm that something exists. And the other way of seeing is by measurement. And so when scientists do experiments in laboratories, they measure things and then statistically determine that such and such a particle exists. Like you might have heard of the Higgs boson that was discovered not long ago. So its existence was determined by millions and millions of repetitive tests. And so the fact that this was measured, that's equivalent to seeing. So the fact that the Higgs boson exists is because it's been observed. How it interacts with the world, that's a scientific theory, and that understanding may be wrong, may be correct, we don't know. So again, interaction with something, that's the proof. Now, as we're talking about this, I'll remind you where we're heading. We're heading towards proof of God's existence. 2 bits here. Laws of nature don't change with time. So gravity is the same today here as it was in the time of Jesus and as it was 1,000,000 years ago, all things being equal, the same conditions. And that means that the term for that is it's time invariant. That's one bit. The second bit relating to proof is space, and that is that the laws of nature don't change with location. I can perform an experiment. I can drop a tennis ball from a certain height and calculate what speed it will have just before impact. I can do that here. I can do that in Alaska. I can do that on Mars, providing other parts of that experiment are the same. Sea level, for example. So what that means is that the laws of nature are also space invariant. They don't depend on space. In other words, they don't depend on location, nor do they depend on when this is being done. And this is where we now come to Jesus' miracles, and that's where Father Nick's earlier comments kick in. The Father's right that Jesus needed to perform miracles in order to prove his divinity. As fathers also say that if you look at what the prophets did, they taught by word of mouth. That was not sufficient. If Christ did the same thing, people would not be convinced that he's God. He had to prove that he's God, and that means he had to do miracles to do that. I'll now quote from the Bible, 2 bits. Jesus said, "If I had not done among them the works which no one else did, they would have no sin. But now they have seen and also hated both me and my Father." Second one, the first one was from John, this one's from Matthew. When John heard in prison about the works of Christ, he sent 2 of his disciples, and they said to him, Are you the coming one, or do we look for another?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Go tell John the things which you hear and see. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Elsewhere in the gospel we read in Matthew, "Suddenly a great tempest arose on the sea, so that the boat was covered with the waves. Then his disciples awoke him, saying, 'Lord, save us, we are perishing.' Then he arose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was great calm." Just two more. Also from Matthew, "Feeding the 5,000 men plus women and children with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Next one is a similar one. "And again, feeding 4,000 with 7 loaves and a few small fish." That's in Mark and the other ones. How is this proved? Witnesses confirmed, people who saw Jesus doing these things, those witnesses, they confirmed that the laws of nature obey Jesus. And since the material universe obeys the laws of nature, this means that Jesus is the ruler of the universe, which translates to Jesus being the creator of the universe and its laws. And since the laws of nature, as we used before the term, since the laws of nature are time invariant, that means that the 2,000-year time gap does not affect their scientific validity. If these events, Jesus' miracles, had occurred in our time, scientists could study them scientifically the same way as they study other natural phenomena. Note that no matter how nature behaves, its behaviour always remains natural. With miracles, the supernatural part pertains to Jesus himself. So just because he did miracles, nature behaved in a certain way, that behaviour is not supernatural. The supernatural bit is Jesus, who is above nature. So the miracles performed by Jesus were witnessed by multitudes of people. The act, as I mentioned before, the act of seeing those miracles is proof that they occurred. Remember, seeing the moon, as proof that the moon exists. Multitudes of people seeing Christ perform miracles, them seeing those miracles proves that they were real, that they occurred. This is no different to cosmologists in our time seeing one-off events like a supernova explosion that would have occurred millions of years ago and no longer exists. Time's not a factor. The fact that it was observed that constitutes the supernova was real. The same thing with Christ's miracles. They were observed. It's not a philosophical issue. That criteria is scientific. That's how scientific experiments or whatever, or theories are confirmed using this process. So that's part one of my talk, which shows that Christ's miracles, because they were observed, they equate to scientific observations. And because Christ was the one and only person who could do this, proves that he's outside of nature, he's above nature, he is supernatural. And that means if he's outside of nature, then he is God. I hope that's clear. The last two bits are a lot quicker. Part two, when scientists perform experiments in laboratories, they manipulate matter and energy. When protons accelerated to near light speed in the Large Hadron Collider you would have heard about. They go around in circles faster and faster and faster till they get near light speed, then the direction has changed and they crash into one another. When they crash, there's so much energy emitted that the energy from the crash creates new particles for a very, very brief moment of time. They come into existence and then they cease existing, then you get back to your normal state. So manipulating matter and energy by scientists creates other matter. And that is science. And so the same applies to Jesus. When he performed miracles, Jesus manipulated matter and energy. What does that mean? It means that Jesus demonstrated his divinity using science. Understand? Is that clear? Okay. So Jesus had to use miracles to prove his divinity. Miracles manipulate matter and energy, and therefore that equates to what he did as being scientific. Part 3. According to church tradition, Jesus only wrote one thing, a message on the ground with his finger, maybe in the sand, to the Jews who wanted to stone the woman who committed adultery. However, and this is how we all understand that Jesus only wrote one thing, but I'm now arguing that Jesus did not only write one thing. He is also the author of the laws of nature and the constants of nature. So scientists, what they do, when they look at how nature behaves, they decode using into mathematical formulae. They decode what they see in nature, and then they write down the equations. So you've heard the equation, the famous one by Einstein, E equals mc squared. Mm-hmm. Newton, F equals ma, force equals mass multiplied by acceleration. They observe these things happening in nature, then they decode that and they write the mathematical formula. But the actual written stuff exists within nature itself as laws of nature and constants of nature. And so when Jesus created the universe, he created not only time, space, matter, energy, he wrote into that creation those laws. So it wasn't written on paper, it wasn't written on the ground, but it's written into nature. Hence, when scientists decode and then write on paper what Jesus wrote in nature, those scientists are revealing more and more of God. And that applies to atheists. So if a scientist, a physicist is an atheist, and away he goes and he sort of identifies how different laws work, that atheist is revealing God's work. And through God's work, he is revealing God himself, not knowing that that's what he's doing. That's why I said earlier back that atheists can be some of the biggest theologians. So that's the third bit. The last bit, I didn't have much time to think about, but limits of science. When you look at science in its pure sense, then science has got no upper limit because it's a revelation of God. The more that is revealed through experimentation or observation or cosmology or whatever it is, the more we know about God. So in that sense, pure science is open-ended. Where problems occur is when scientists, and specifically atheistic scientists, when they use philosophy masquerading as science to try to negate God. So that's fake science. So, and in fact, I think a good example is, in order to get around God, atheist scientists have got no option but to go down the path of the multi-universe. There are many, many theories about multiple universes. We won't go into that, but the way the logic works there is that if beyond our observable universe, beyond that horizon, if there is an infinite number of other universes, then statistically, just by pure probability, you will come across a universe that has the right conditions for life. It's got the right laws of nature, it's got the constants of nature, they're all just spot on. And that's by pure probability. The fallacy is that it's not a scientific fact that there are other universes out there. It's if there are, then you don't need God. But if is the bogey. That's not a scientific if. So that, and if you don't have these other universes, if you have got this universe that we know exists, that cannot be infinite. There's a term called entropy. Entropy describes how energy decays and becomes less and less useful. If you get a jug of boiling water, it's boiling, you can use that heat to do work. You can have a little model car with a little engine, and you can use that heat for that car to drive. It can do stuff. And then you leave this jug of boiling water for an hour, it will cool off. Still the same amount of energy, it just dissipates, but quantity-wise, it's still there. But it becomes less useful, it becomes not useful at all in the end. So, if we just had this universe, and it started at the Big Bang, when it was all really super hot, possibly infinitely hot, with time, it cools. We know that it cools, we can measure. Just shortly after the Big Bang, from memory, the temperature of the universe was calculated to be about 6,000 degrees. Now it's 2.6 degrees Kelvin. It's cooled down completely. You can measure that. So, and that's entropy at work. If there is only the one universe, then, and if you then try to claim that it existed forever, therefore you don't need God. If it existed forever, it would have cooled down to nothing, and we would not be here. So it means it had to have a beginning in time, a finite time for us to exist. So if we have one universe, and it clearly then had to have a beginning in time, that, in fact, according to Stephen Hawking, his comment was, I think, in his book called A Brief History of Time from Memory, he says, as long as we have a starting point time-wise, then we have every right to claim that there was a creator. And so because of that, it makes scientific sense to have a creator of a universe if it started in time. And in fact, when time started at that point, that really annoys the hell out of atheists. So they need to get around that problem, and that's how they do it, by telling fibs. I think rather limits. I just think that we'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We haven't had any questions come through.
Oh,
You've bamboozled us all.
Well, look, the real bit that I said this at the beginning, that science could be so complex in a sense, even though what we discussed was not complex really, but if you don't have a scientific background, you can sort of not know how to react. One of the reasons why I go down this path is because if people believe that science, because it deals in fact, apparently, if scientists claim that they can bypass God, then because a scientist or scientists said this, then that means God doesn't exist. And if it doesn't exist, anything goes. And then you have all sorts of sins. You know, life, just do what you want. And especially the younger people who now go to university, they are exposed to this sort of logic. And they are convinced by this. And particularly when you add to this logic their belief that faith is not factual, that it's not based on any evidence, which is not true, but that's what they believe it to be. You put those things two together. Faith is just a belief system, and scientists say there's no God. So, and that package drives them away. There's a question that Father Nick mentioned. This was when somebody asked cradle Orthodox and converts. And the way I can link that bit to this bit is that cradle Orthodox are born into the faith, into the Orthodox faith, and to them it's natural. So it's part of their heart, it's part of their belief, this is just part of life for them, and they grow up. Then when they get to sort of a semi-mature age, and again I'm referring to, late teenage onwards, from the heart, the brain kicks in, stuff becomes intellectual, and they intellectually analyse that question, and they form a wrong conclusion. The opposite happens with converts. They're not born into orthodoxy, so they search, and the search initially is intellectual. So the first bit was non-intellectual, then it becomes intellectual, and that intellectual discovery of the new world, they lose their orthodoxy. Here, you have people using the intellect, and through the intellect, in their search for God, they discover God through their orthodoxy, and then it affects their heart. It's an exact opposite process. It doesn't happen all the time, but that's a significant part bit that I see it that way.
Very good point. Thank you.
Okay.
There's actually a question.
What can you say about the God particle in the human brain? Has any scientific work been done on it? I don't think the God particle...
No, that's true. The term God particle...
It's a different concept.
The God particle does not exist in the human brain. What's been... that God particle in the scientific arena refers to the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is a particle which is in part of a field, like if you have a magnetic field and a magnet, you have a Higgs boson particle with a field. And very early in the creation of the universe, that field, the Higgs field, gave mass to other particles. So without the Higgs field, everything would be like a photon. It would have no mass. It would be flying around everywhere. And matter wouldn't behave the way it behaves. That's the God particle. Certainly, scientists are sort of not particularly happy that in the neuroscience area, there are areas identified that encourage people to search for God. And then they try to come up with philosophical arguments saying, oh, well, that's sort of a Darwinian evolution type of process for survival. But that's, it's not a physical part of the brain that's been identified, even if we were to accept a God particle as being something relevant here. There's no particle. In fact, the brain doesn't have one very specific part that does one thing. The whole brain is usually involved in, whether it's consciousness or anything else, in our thinking process, in our feelings. Okay.
I had one question about, it might be still on topic, but a question about an approach to ethics and how there seems to be, that's one of the areas where the church and scientists kind of come to loggerheads and can come to...
Okay, before you continue, that's what the world would have us believe, that scientists have got one view and the theologians have got another view. There were some very, very serious surveys conducted over the last century. One survey was done 4 times, in the 1920s, and I'm not sure, 30s, 40s. Then the last time it was conducted was, I think, 1997, from memory. I think it's accurate. 2 questions were asked at the same time, on each occasion. And these questions were asked of physicists, mathematicians, and biologists, and I think astronomers, across a whole swag of universities in America. And I think there were about 1,000 scientists were asked this question. 1, do you believe in a personal God who can hear you and answer your questions? The second question was, do you believe in the afterlife? And this is what really, certainly in 1997, when I read the results of those surveys, there was just a bit of an uproar in the scientific community, where certain journals and magazines would be telling off, they'd be really giving a roasting to the believing scientists because they were in the majority. So over 100 years, those who claimed to be atheists were always in the minority. Then, I think it was 2015, there was another really major survey done among scientists, and again, relying on memory here, there was about 11 countries involved, and there were about 60,000 scientists were surveyed, of which some 9,000 responded to the survey. And again, as I recall, it was only in France where atheists outnumbered believers. It was 51% to 49%. Everywhere else, the atheists were in the minority. 2015. I've actually got the figures and the data there. So the view that scientists are primarily atheistic is a big fictitious. It's a lie. The data's not there.
Yeah. This might be a good moment for me. Could I just have the microphone? It might be a good moment to round things off because we're approaching 9 o'clock, and okay. This is the time that we normally finish with our theology group. The reason why I decided to begin this particular series of talks in this combination is with my accent in my little talk on the meeting, on our personal relationship with God and people, primarily with God, because this was sort of more important for to begin this way, and inviting Father Nicholas Zelinkovic to speak about science in a way which is positive, Both of us have great respect for science and technology, as long as it's not abused. And that's the sad part of it, that, you know, scientists, if they are not guided by ethical principles founded on their faith, as Father Nicholas brought to your notice this the results of these surveys. Well, those scientists that have no God in their heart, I fear for the way that they can behave, and the technologies that they can introduce. If there's no proper, what we would term fear of God. Now that expression comes from the book of Proverbs, which is, hundreds of years before Christ. There is wisdom in that, in a certain respect for God and His world, His creation. And if scientists have that, then we're on the same page. And we certainly want to be on the same page. Now there is there was a very prominent 20th century theologian, Russian theologian, Father George Florovsky, and he spoke of something that he called the neo-patristic synthesis, because he pointed out that in the times of the great fathers, they had the utmost respect for the science of their times. All right? And I think it is very sad when religious people think that we have no common ground with science. And also it's very sad when scientific people, people of science, think that religion, that there's an abyss, a divide that cannot be bridged between faith and science. That is not the case. We would like to suggest that there is a continuum. There are different modes or ways or paths of knowledge. And what I wanted to talk about tonight was the biblical path of knowledge, which is the personal relationship. Okay? That's the only way that knowledge of God Himself can be gained. God cannot be studied objectively. Mm-hmm. His world certainly can be studied objectively, and His world and His creation, as the Bible says, speak of Him. His creation speaks of Him. So if science studies the creation, the world around us, it then can help us religious people to come to a blended view, a harmonious combination where religion and science can complement each other and can help each other. And some of the greatest scientists were actually fervent believers, fervent Christians. And I think that their faith actually gave them the inspiration often for the discoveries that they made in science and mathematics. There are great names. We can cover that maybe in a future talk, but I think that the time has come when we should be more open in these discussions and bringing, the subject to the table, and to talk about these different ways of knowledge, but which nevertheless can complement each other. All right? Yep. Okay, so I thank you all for your attention. I thank Father Nicholas for his very clear talk on scientific principles, and God willing, we will see you or we'll see each other in virtual terms in a fortnight's time. It was mentioned the sort of things that I'll be talking about. I have yet to formulate the exact topic for my next talk, but we'll be making announcements, and we'll put up advertisements on our website, pokrov.com.au. All right. I think we can now end with the Paschal prayer, the 9th ode of the canon. Shine, shine, O New Jerusalem, for the glory of the Lord has risen upon thee. Now dance for joy and be glad, O Zion, and thou, O Theotokos, thou pure Mother of God, rejoice in the rising of him whom thou didst bear. Thank you all. Christ is risen.
Truly is risen.